Welcome to your tutorial on step 2, writing your proposal for your argumentative inquiry project. At this point, you should have read through several petitions on change.org and perhaps even looked through some potential topics on a couple of different websites. The websites that are listed here are just a couple links that you can kind of search through, but they do a good job of showing some really nice prompts that you might consider if you're having a hard time deciding exactly what topic you want to do. So there's a nice list here and then a nice list here as well. And you can also definitely consider working with one of the things that you read about in your petitions from change.org. After reading through some petitions and browsing through the topics, you're going to be ready to write your proposal. And we've kind of broken that down for you here, and I am going to fill in my example so you guys can kind of follow along and see what that looks like. So the first thing it asks you is what is your topic in 1 or 2 words. So after reading some things, I decided I was kind of interested in video game violence. So I'm going to just put that. Okay, so it's really broad. I'm not saying what I think about video game violence. I'm not getting into any of the details about that. I'm just kind of saying generally what the topic is. The next box says, write your issue in the form of a question. So I need to think about how I can take these words and put it into a question that's more specific about what my topic actually is. So instead of just saying video game violence, I'm going to phrase this as a question. Does violence in video games cause people to be violent in real life? Right, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm not, or from here, I could have been talking about is the violence realistic? Is cartoon violence better? Whatever. But this shows me more specifically what I'm actually looking at. And what I'm interested in is if there's any proof that violence in video games actually causes people to be violent in the real world. Okay, the next box asks you, who does your issue affect? And you want to be really careful, as it says in the directions, to not say everyone, because honestly, video game violence doesn't affect my grandma at all, so I can't say that it affects everyone. So I need to think about specifically who video game violence really affects. So for me, I'm thinking that it probably affects teenagers and young people who play a lot of video games a whole lot more than anybody else. So especially teenagers who play video games are affected by this issue. Parents are probably also affected, right? Because it's the parents who are deciding, especially for like middle school age students, what kind of video games they're buying. So parents are affected, and also video game companies. Okay, so I actually have 3 different audiences that are being affected. The people who play the games, the people who buy the games, and then the video game companies that make the games themselves. All right, so that's what I'm going to do for my 3rd area. Now guys, you want to take your time and really think about this. Notice that I didn't just put young people in America, right? I put young people, especially teenagers. I thought about the parents who buy them. I thought about the people who create them. I'm trying to be as specific as I can. So take your time with this. This is going to make your next step a lot easier. Your next section asks you about sources. It says winning arguments need sources of information to back up claims. How will you win your argument? What kind of sources will you need to find? All right, so at this point you need to think about your opinion about this issue, which you're going to actually list out for us in just a minute. But for me, I think I'm going to argue that video game violence does not cause real life violence. So I need to think about how I would prove that point and what kind of sources I would need to find. Now in this section, it doesn't say it in the directions, but we're going to ask you to have at least 3 potential types of sources. If you want to list out more, you're welcome to, but you have examples there that show you blog posts, statistics, commercial websites, books, database articles, interviews, research and scholarly articles, etc. Out of those and any others you can think of, what are some types of sources that you need? So one of the things that I think would be really good to prove that video games don't cause violence are just some testimonials from video game players. Okay, so just people who are proving that they might play violent video games but are not really violent themselves. Okay. The second thing, though, since the testimonials are kind of opinion, I'd also like to put in some really good facts there. So I think that it would be good to find some statistics or research showing violence in video games doesn't cause real life violence. So I've got some opinions from the video gamers themselves. I've got some kind of facts from statistics and research. I also think it might be a good idea to sort of round out my sources by having maybe some interviews with some video game creators themselves. And that way we can have those creators actually talk about why they think violence in video games is important, why they actually put it there anyways. So I'm going to say interviews with game creators. Okay, now of course, as I get further into my research, I may be able to find more sources than just these 3, but at least I have a starting point now and know when I start actually looking for sources, the types of sources I should begin looking out for. Okay, your next box here says in 2 to 3 sentences explain your current opinion about the issue. And this is where you're going to actually start answering this question in what you currently think. Again, you may have read a petition, you may have just seen the topic listed somewhere, you may have personal firsthand experience with it, but right now you're pretty uninformed as far as these sources are concerned. So this is just your first shot at what you think about this. So video games have been around for a long time and they have always had some sort of violence in them. Even Mario Kart has its players throwing things at other carts. Yes, Mario Kart, my favorite video game ever. Totally awesome at that. I do not believe that violence in video games causes real world violence because I believe that gamers are able to tell real life from video game life. If I had my choice, though, video games would be less violent. Okay, so that's 3 sentences there, and in my 3 sentences I do a few things. First of all, I give kind of some context for the issue. So video game violence is not something new. Video games have been around for a while, and this argument has been around for a while. And so I kind of tell my reader a little bit about the issue itself. In my second sentence here, I start actually talking about what I think. And notice that I tell you my opinion. I don't believe that it causes it. And then I tell you why I think that right now, because gamers can tell the difference between real life and video game life. And then I added a third sentence, a short one here, that honestly, even though I don't believe that video game violence causes real life violence, I would actually prefer if video games were kind of all like Mario Kart, where it was kind of more cartoon violence instead of real stuff. Okay, so that's where I have explained my current issue. And then my last thing says, what do you currently see as the major argument against your opinion? So what would the opposition argue? So in this box, I'm thinking about if somebody disagreed with me, if they thought that violence in video games did actually cause real world violence, what their major argument would be. Even though I disagree with it, I could see where someone who actually did believe in violence in video games would maybe talk about some of the shootings that have happened at schools and talk about how video games are more realistic now than ever before, and so maybe it blurs that line a little bit. So that's what I'm going to type in this box here. So I can't type. The major argument against my opinion is probably the number of mass shootings that have happened in the United States, especially school shootings. The opposition may also argue that current video games are really realistic. So the difference between real life and video game life is a little blurred. Okay? So this is a really nice proposal that we've written here. We've identified the issue, we've made it into a question, we've figured out who it affects, we've sort of thought through some sources that we could use to prove our point, we've thought about what our opinion currently is, and we've considered the other side, which is also really important when constructing a good argument. So once you guys are done with this, once you've got all of these boxes filled in, they might not be quite as long as mine, but they should be pretty close because you want to take your time on this and describe things really well. You're going to follow these directions right down here. You're going to submit this document in Google Classroom. Both me and Ms. Wolk are going to look over your proposals and give you some feedback if we feel like you need that and approve you to move on to the next step. You have to have a nice proposal in order to be approved, so take your time with this step. Rewatch parts of this tutorial if you need to, if you need some help on each step, and go for it. Make sure you are convincing so that you can get something that matters to you argued really effectively. Let us know if you have any questions.